Welcome back to Draft Central's coverage of the 2020 AFL Draft. We'll be discussing the highlights of the first round of the AFL Draft from pick 10 onwards. What a round it was. There were plenty of bolters: Luke Pedlar, Ryan Angwin and Max Holmes, just three of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sort of kicking it off there with Luke Pedlar at the start. Adelaide obviously had to jump in pretty quickly to make sure the likes of GWS, Fremantle couldn't snap him up. So obviously a player who was high on the list of some of those clubs. What, Ed, do you see in him, and what do you think sort of had him in those rankings so high?
Yeah, so Luke Pedlar is an absolute bull. So he's the player that will get in and under and really go in hard for the ball. Plays more of a midfield forward, a bit like a Jack Zeeble. Very strong and powerful type of player who can burst from the stoppages. Very strong tackler. Was the captain of his school football team at PAC, so he's definitely got the right pedigree. I mean, he's had a few injury issues, but he's as tough as nails.
Yeah, and then from Ed to one of your favourite players in Ryan Angwin, Pete, a guy who's drawn a lot of comparisons to Xavier Dersma. We say he's got a little something about him. Do you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Like Ryan Angwin, he's just a superb talent. Like, I think that a lot of people might be a bit surprised he went that high, and I guess in many ways you would be, but on talent alone, I think if he'd played this year, he could have been one that was a real bolter. He's obviously quite light. Only came in at about 72 kilos at the start of the year, and that was after he put on weight because he was 62 at the start of his bottom age year. But look, he's got so much courage, so much toughness. He's got a lot of upside. He uses the ball fairly well. He's able to play in a lot of positions. So for me, I think Angwin's just a terrific pickup, and I'd be really pleased with that. So
yeah. I mean, like looking down the line as well, Max Holmes, Geelong sort of had to jump in ahead of Melbourne to get him, and other bolters. I mean, you can even put Connor Stone into that category a little bit with GWS there. Blake Coleman as well. Collingwood, really been sort of in the thick of things, and Matt Allison to round it off as well. A pretty cool pick for the Saints there. A real sort of dynamic utility. I mean, we talk about bolters. Braden Cook's like the ultimate for this year. It's just that we've had him in those discussions for a long time now that it's almost like he's not.
He's almost a slider.
Category.
He's almost been a bolter and now he's slid.
Yeah.
But he's probably about where he is. So yeah. No, definitely.
You mentioned Collingwood there. What have Collingwood done here with their trades? They've been very active in bidding, trading picks. We saw they bid on Brisbane Lions Academy prospect Blake Coleman. That one was matched. They bid on Lockie Jones, a Port Adelaide Next Generation Academy prospect that was matched. But they were very active with their trades in hoping to get up the draft board. How have you seen Collingwood's night play out?
Yeah, I think Collingwood have done fantastic, to be honest. They've sort of, obviously, well publicised trade week, but their draft, look, you can't fault their draft hand. Thought they might trade up, they didn't, and they didn't quite get the tall they wanted, but I reckon the next two picks that they've done, which we'll get into in a sec, I reckon they're going to be able to grab a tall with them, which will be fantastic. There's a couple still floating around. So, I mean, you look at who they picked up. Obviously, Ollie Henry, he's able to play up either end, gives them size. Finlay McRae's that inside midfield, uses it well. And then you've got Reeve McInnes, who, again, another big player. They need a few tall ones. So he's fantastic. And then they've been able to effectively get rid of the Nick Dacos pick next year, if you like, the first rounder. And they've traded in effectively 2 second-rounders and Adelaide's third-rounder because they did the second trade with Adelaide just then. And they only dropped 2 spots from that. So that's fantastic for Collingwood. Remarkably, their trading in the draft period is better than the trade period. So it's just been fantastic. So they've been able to do that. So effectively for Collingwood fans, being able to trade out that first rounder next year, they've traded in 2 second rounders and a third rounder, which if you look at where finishing positions were, they've effectively got about pick 37 for free. So that's how much of the benefit they've got, which is fantastic. So they've got points for Dacos and they've been able to get picks in. So for me personally, I've really enjoyed Collingwood's hand.
Agree. Yeah, I mean, Ed, you'd probably be able to shine a bit more light on it as well, but a lot hinged on that McInnes bid as well. So, if that came before their first picks, they might have been in a bit of trouble, might have been sweating a bit and having to trade up again there. So I guess they're lucky in a sense that he slid a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it turned out perfectly for him in the end.
Yeah, like McInnes, like he's that 193 centimetre potential mid. I mean, that's the type of player that Essendon probably would have looked for a bid. But after the work they tried to do to get the Dunkley deal done in the trade period, I think there was a bit of good grace there. So I think that's why Essendon, threw Collingwood a bone there, and then they get a pretty late bid, which they'd be very happy about.
And one thing like that I noticed, like obviously, I just sort of had a look there with we're talking about players that play together, like we've sent with obviously McRae and McInnes and stuff. Adelaide have the South Australians too that they've picked up. Obviously Tilthorpe, Pedlar, and then Cook. They traded up to get. So that's quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean they've gone local. They sort of claim no local bias, but I mean they've done it, which is not a bad thing at all. So yeah, good for them.
We've seen my beloved Roos pick Will Phillips up at number 3, Mr. Consistent, I like to call him. And they've also picked up Tom Powell at pick number 13. Why have they doubled up on midfielders when an Oliver Henry was available and even a Finlay McRae? Why pick Tom Powell? What will he bring to the club as another midfielder?
Well, I mean, you can't get too much of a good thing, can you? So he's going to be that consistent ball winner as well. I know, Siobhan, maybe you're a little bit concerned about that, but, he's a phenomenal player. Tom Powell averaged over 35 touches in the under-18. So I think what North Melbourne needs really in a least rebuild is players that they can rely on. So Powell's going to be that in the midfield alongside with Phillips. And I mean, look at a team like Fremantle. They've got a plethora of sort of key defensive options. They've got Heath Chapman that they've picked up. So, a similar approach. You can say the same for Collingwood in that they've got McRae. He's probably a bit different in that he uses the ball pretty well compared to some of their other mids, bar Pendlebury.
Right.
So
all right.
maybe a bit of an unnecessary hit there. But, I mean, a few clubs have sort of doubled up in a sense there.
We saw Tanner Bruhn didn't quite make it into the top 10 picks, but then went to GWS at pick 13, so didn't last long as Michael predicted. What type of player are GWS getting in Tanner Bruhn, and were you surprised to see that he didn't also make it into the top 10?
Yeah, so Tanner Bruhn, Giants have a really good player with him. I mean, me and Michael saw him on last Wednesday at that training session. He was one of the most competitive players there. And it looks like no matter which state he'd go to, I don't think there's any go-home factor with Bruhn. He's going to do really well there. I mean, Essendon could have looked at him in through that midfield. He would have been a good pick in that top 10. But, Giants weren't going to let him slide too much off him. Like, he's an absolute star of a player. I mean, he's had his injuries, but there's a reason he's rated quite highly. It's because he's had a good under-16s year and he's a quality person.
Yeah, I mean, just the sort of player that I think GWS will need, that, he's got the class, he sort of, suits the Ferrari sort of mould, but he's also pretty tough. He's a country boy, just really uncompromising and has really good intent going at the footy and just generates that meterage and goes forward and keeps on hunting the ball. So I think he'll be really great and reliable for that GWS midfield.
Yep.
We saw Melbourne select 2 small forwards in Bailey Laurie and Jake Bowie. What's Melbourne's approach here by selecting 2 very similar players? Are they similar players? Where do you think they'll start in the Melbourne team, if they will? And what are the key differences between the 2 players, even though they do share a similar position?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about doubling up. Melbourne's another club there that did do that. I know, Pete, you love the sort of way that they use the ball as well. They're 2 really classy players going forward. And with Cozzy Pickett, they could potentially form a really sort of handy mosquito fleet for the Demons. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, I definitely think Melbourne have done well with those back-to-back picks. Very similar players, but they needed more of those sort of classy, smaller forwards who they can play up the ground as well, and they use the ball well, make good decisions. So I think that's a fantastic call by Melbourne there. And I just think they need more good ball users, and they've been able to pick them up. And I think they're for good value there too. So we say if they're good enough, they're big enough, and certainly for those guys, it's the case.
We mentioned before that Collingwood are a little sneaky with their bids on academy players. They bid on Lockie Jones and also Blake Coleman. Lockie connected to Port Adelaide and Blake Coleman connected to Brisbane. Both the clubs chose to match those bids. Why did Collingwood bid on those players, and what will they bring to both Port Adelaide and Brisbane respectively?
Yeah, so obviously very different players. We've got Lockie Jones, who's more of that tough defender that'll play in that back line for Port there. So obviously He's, got that real talent ready-made, played at league level already. He's already got that talent. And Blake Coleman, obviously, he's been playing at quaffle level. He's already had that experience as well. More of a long-term prospect. Obviously, he's got to build his endurance base, but he's got, a full array of tricks and someone who's got a lot of class and talent. So for me, it was a no-brainer for those clubs to match, and they probably got good value, particularly Jones slipped down a bit. So it wouldn't have been too hard for Port to choose to match that. So, yeah, I think they'll be both very happy to have done that.
Looking at some of the players that are still on the draft board, who do you see coming in the second round at different picks, and who are you surprised hasn't been taken yet, and who do you think will be around that second round mark?
Yeah, I think Nathan O'Driscoll would be really hard to pass up sort of in that first pick straight off the board. So I'd expect him to be in the mix. Whether a trade sort of happens or around that mark, who knows. But yeah, I mean, Caleb Poulter is a player I really like. So he could be off the board pretty quickly. Liam Collar's one who has a bit of interest for Adelaide. I mean, the list goes on. There could be bids. Errol Goulden, Connor Downey, Brandon Walker. So yeah, plenty of options there. Yeah,
and clubs are trading down. Obviously, Collingwood keeps trading down. So that's quite interesting. They might be looking at trying to bring in another tall. They might get Jackson Keller. Obviously, Kane Baldwin, if someone wants to take a risk. Obviously, coming off a couple of knees, he's still floating around. And then you've got all the project tools, like sort of mentioned, like Collar. And obviously, there's Liam McMahon, there's Ollie Lord. Like, there's a heap of them that are potentially at the back end. So I think from here, it's going to get quite interesting. I am surprised Poulter's still on the board. But yeah, I think from here on, it's going to get very, very interesting for what clubs like.
Just before we get into the second round, little quirk, Collingwood have selected Finlay McRae, brother of Jackson McRae from the Western Bulldogs, and also Oliver Henry, who's the brother of Jack Henry at Geelong. So they've both got the brothers of, and it'd be remiss of us not to mention that Jamara Ugle-Hagan going at pick number 1 to the Western Bulldogs is only the second ever Indigenous player to have been selected at pick number 1. So congratulations to Jamara. Join us back again at Draft Central for our round 2 recap as we look forward to plenty more players getting selected.